Welcome to our last lecture in the class, and appropriately enough, this lecture is on teleology, and teleology is about ends. Just as this is the last lecture in our class, teleology is focused on the final purpose, the final ends of an action. It is the belief that there is a design, purpose, or finality in the universe, and that morality is part of this intentional and integrated order. All human actions, therefore, ought to be undertaken with reference to this order and guided toward achieving our proper end. The mode of reasoning analogy I'm going to use here is hero worship, because in so many ways, a teleology sets up a goal of perfection for us, and in regards to human behavior, it's a goal usually of moral perfection. And we, as human beings, try to model our behavior after that model of moral perfection. Teleology suggests that all human work is guided by a purpose. That ultimately the world will come to its fruition, to its end, and when it does, human beings in so many ways will be fully actualized in every possible way, and for the purpose of this course, people will be actualized morally, will have been in so many ways perfected. It's the belief that efficient causes, things that we do every day, we could think of efficient causes as things events we are involved in, circumstances in which we find ourselves, are ultimately directed toward useful results that are the final cause. That is, it's the belief that even in our everyday world, we are ordering our lives towards a final purpose. Now, if we're talking about a religious teleology, of course, we're ordering our lives towards, if we're talking about Christianity or Judaism or Islam, we're ordering our lives towards, an eternal life. If we are Buddhist, we're ordering our lives towards nirvana. If we are Hindu, we're ordering our lives towards moksha, or liberation. In any case, from a religious perspective, it's with that goal in mind of eternal life, let's say, in Christianity, that I move ahead and I perform acts of generosity, acts of altruism, and acts of moral worth. Human life itself is guided towards a purpose from a teleological perspective. Intrinsic finality consists in the fact that every being has within itself a natural tendency whereby its activity is directed towards the perfection of its own nature. So, in so many ways, everything, not just human beings, but and not just living things, everything is ordered towards its own perfection according to a teleological perspective. If you're saying to yourself right now, this sounds a little bit like natural law and teleology usually work very hand in hand. This belief that there's an order in the universe is very much tied to this idea that order has a purpose and a finality, a goal towards which it is functioning. A teleological ethic is normally focused on a transcendent model of perfection against which our immediate character and behavior are judged. In Christianity, there is one. In Judaism, there is a model of perfection, but it doesn't have to be a religion. For instance, Aristotle and the ancient philosophers had this idea that real human beings on earth, were imperfect reflections of a perfect form of humanity, and that it really was our mission here on earth to perfect ourselves, and part of that perfecting ourselves was moral perfection. Some of these models of perfection are actual historical figures whose story has been modified hagiographically, others are mythical or fictional figures. So, for instance, Jesus. Jesus is considered a historical figure, but he's also, his story has been altered in some ways to make him much more of a mythical figure as well. We have Buddha as well, a real historical figure. At least that's the presumption on the part of those who study religions. But also there's the belief that the story has been altered and idealized. Buddhists, of course, are supposed to be modeling their behavior after Buddha, and Christians are supposed to be modeling their behavior after Jesus. Jesus and Buddha are these teleological models of perfection that we judge our own actions against. Saints in the Catholic tradition. So we could point to a number of saints in the Catholic tradition. For instance, Saint Francis of Assisi is a saint who embodies the perfection of humanity, at least on a moral level and religious level. Abraham Lincoln, his story, he was a real historical figure, but in many ways his story has been altered hagiographically so that he is in many ways like a national saint. There are many of these myths or mythical stories about Abraham Lincoln's life. When he was younger, he walked 10 miles to return a dime to someone who had overpaid for an item at his store. He's known as Honest Abe because he always did honest things. And we have all these stories from his childhood, from his teenage years, from his adulthood, before he became president, that tell us what I'll put quotes, or if I was speaking to you in class and you could see me, I'm putting quotes around this idea of saint. He is, in so many ways, a national saint. George Washington in the same way. Remember, he cuts down the cherry tree, and he's honest about it. He goes and he admits that he cuts down the cherry tree. There are many of these sorts of stories about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln that make them these kinds of national saint figures. Horatio Alger, if we want to bring this discussion into a business setting, Horatio Alger, at least in earlier ages, you may not recognize the name, but in earlier ages, Horatio Alger was this model of perfection for the burgeoning capitalist, for the entrepreneur, who was Horatio Alger were rags to riches stories, where a person who grew up in abject poverty had applied himself and had, ultimately, reaped the rewards of his efforts and his intelligence and so on and so forth. And Horatio Alger, in a lot of ways, is not a real figure. He's really just a character in a novel. Nevertheless, Horatio Alger has been used for decades and decades in the United States as this model of entrepreneurial perfection. Anyway, that's teleology. Teleology, a teleological moralist will ask questions when confronted with a moral conundrum, will ask questions like, what would Jesus do if you're a Christian? What would Buddha do if you were a Buddhist? What would Saint Francis do? It's these kinds of questions. What would Abraham Lincoln do if I'm an American? Some Americans would ask that. It's this comparing our own behavior to the behavior of a model of perfection.